real tall people in here. Um, Good evening, everyone. As Karen mentioned, my name is Marley Klaas. I'd also like to just take this brief opportunity to mention that you may notice from my accent that I am not local, but I am in fact an islander. I am a child of the Pacific from the Republic of Palau, so I do share the same sentiments and experiences that we as citizens of small island developing states tend to share. That said, I'm here to speak to you about mitigation. What I'm planning to do this evening is give a little bit of a background on generally what we mean when we say mitigation in terms of the global negotiations, and then further dive into what the main headliner on mitigation was during this past COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. Okay, so mitigation, what do we mean? So when we talk about mitigation, we're really thinking about party or country efforts that they put forward that should be helping to mitigate against further impacts of climate change. When we say mitigation, you can think about long-term low-emission development strategies. What that looks like is, for example, countries' emission reduction pathways. We can also think about the binding emission reduction targets that are stated in the Kyoto Protocol. Again, those are a little bit more geared towards, they are more geared towards industrialized countries or developed countries. And then you can also think about nationally determined contributions as called for under the Paris Agreement. Now, the main headliner during this past COP was the Mitigation Work Program. What the Mitigation Work Program is in essence what's meant to, what's up with the slides? I didn't press it. Okay, so the Mitigation Work Program is a program that's intended to allow for the scale up of mitigation ambition and implementation in this critical decade, that being now up until 2030. When we think about the contributing factors that help push for the identification of the need of a work program, we can think back to science, and really coming from a small island state, you can really just look in your backyard and know that increased action is very much needed. But when we speak about science, you can think about what has come out from the IPCC assessment reports. The working group, one's contribution reconfirming that the 1.5 degree Celsius goal is still within reach. However, deep and sustained emission reductions will be needed. More specifically, globally, we would need to reduce emissions by 45% by 2030, and then also reach net zero by 2050. Then there is also contributions from the Working Group 3 report that then also calls for the need to peak emissions as soon as possible, and also to have emissions by 2030. In addition, one of the major pushes for this was also finally some agreement and alignment from the G7 countries that the 1.5 degree goal must be maintained. Now, a little bit on the mitigation priorities for the Caribbean. You will notice that some of these are rooted in the principles of the Mitigation Work Program, some of which I will touch on. Others are supposed to come about as a result of the Mitigation Work Program. So first, one of the priorities was to make sure that the temperature increase is limited to 1.5 degrees, that mitigation action is increased for developed countries to take the lead on increasing mitigation ambition, for major emitters to join in keeping the 1.5 degree Celsius limit within reach, and for greater investment and collaboration for a just transition, as well as finance for sustainable development. Now, so some of the principles that were highlighted in the Mitigation Work Program, what was negotiated and agreed to at COP. First of all, the Mitigation Work Program reaffirms the Paris Agreement temperature goal. It was agreed that the Mitigation Work Program would be non-prescriptive, non-punitive, that it'd be a facilitative dialogue where folks can come together and talk about different projects, different ideas, partnerships that could come about to increase mitigation actions and projects, and that it will not impose any new or binding targets or goals. Additionally, it recalls the need for developed countries to support developing countries on mitigation actions. All right. Now, the scope of the work of the mitigation work program covers broad thematic areas, including all sectors that were mentioned in the 2006 IPCC guidelines for national greenhouse gas inventories. Those include things such as energy, waste, agriculture, forestry, other land uses, as well as industry. It also covers things in the IPCC assessment report, 6th assessment report, working group 3 contributions, which largely include what I previously mentioned, as well as things such as policies, legislation, etc. Just additional that there's many. If you are interested in learning what those additional thematic areas are, you could easily track it if you just search it up. There's a bunch of thematic areas included there. It also includes enabling conditions, technologies, transition, and cross-cutting issues. The work program begins immediately and runs through 2026, and then in 2026 we would have a conversation about whether or not the need to extend the mitigation work program will happen, and then we will decide that, whether it'll be up until 2030 or sometime before 2030. Now, additional details on the program: there will be at least 2 global dialogues, and these can be held in conjunction with other existing dialogues. So for example, if you think about regional climate weeks, this is something that the mitigation work program dialogues can be taking place together, so that it reduces the financial strain on smaller economies to have to sort of be pushing nationals to different spaces and have different conversations all throughout the year. So that's one good thing that was agreed to. Also includes party and non-party stakeholders. There will be dialogues specifically tailored to unlock finance and just transition. Secretariat will then prepare a report on what happens during the dialogue, so there will be that to refer to. And then the subsidiary bodies also would then have to recommend a draft decision for adoption at every subsequent COP. Additionally, co-chairs of the mitigation work program will then present findings, best practices, opportunities from the mitigation work program to the high-level ministerial roundtable. That could then be up for discussion at that political level. So what's next when we think about the mitigation work program? Coming up is appointment of the co-chairs. They'll be choosing one from a developed country and one from a developing country. Parties and non-parties will then be invited to make submissions on what they want to see being discussed during mitigation work program dialogues. The co-chairs will then take those submissions and decide on a select few that will be discussed at each dialogue. There'll be, again, at least 2 dialogues per year. And then once those topics are selected, they'll be announced, as well as venues for the dialogues. Now, going back to submissions, one thing here that we can think about in terms of the Caribbean region that's an opportunity is that we can think about sort of pushing a submission to the co-chairs on what you'd hope would be discussed during the dialogues. Thinking back to the priorities that were identified, there includes unlocking finance. So submission on unlocking finance could be made. Submission on just transition, what you envision is a just transition for the Caribbean. And also an ask for geographically and economically appropriate technology that will allow for a just transition. Those are just some ideas we can do further exploring. And that is pretty much it on the mitigation work program. And thank you very much.